It was the morning of November 21st, 1943. The sun rose over Tarawa Atoll like a torch igniting the Pacific sky, turning the coral sands into a glare that burned the eyes of every Marine crouched behind landing craft armor. Betio Island, just 2 miles long and half a mile wide, was about to become one of the bloodiest pieces of ground in the Pacific. The Marines of the 2nd Division, hardened by months of training but new to real amphibious assault, were already drenched in sweat before they even hit the shore. The lagoon in front of them shimmered like glass, shallow and deceptive, concealing reefs that would trap hundreds of landing craft before the day was done. When the naval bombardment lifted, a heavy silence fell over the reef. Columns of smoke rose from Japanese positions. The Marines believed little could have survived the barrage that had poured nearly 3 million pounds of ordnance onto Betio. Then, through the drifting haze, movement appeared. From bunkers and shattered palm log trenches, white cloths began to wave, small strips tied to sticks fluttering above the sandbags. White flags, someone muttered over a radio net. From several Higgins boats, Marines could see them clearly through binoculars. Some appeared to be held by figures crawling from wrecked positions. Others were planted on the sand, unmoving. It looked like surrender. After 2 days of relentless shelling, it seemed the enemy had broken. Officers aboard control boats hesitated. The Japanese rarely surrendered, but reports began filtering across different sectors. More flags, more movement, no visible fire. The assault waves were ordered forward again. Amphibious tractors churned across the coral flats, their treads grinding against the reef. Men waited behind them, rifles lifted above their heads, the water chest deep in places. The approach was slow, exposed, and silent except for the hum of engines and the rattle of equipment against steel. White flags still fluttered ahead, swaying gently in the humid air. A few hundred yards from the beach, machine gun bursts erupted. Tracer fire slashed through the haze. The white flags dropped instantly. Dozens of concealed bunkers opened up at once, their guns positioned low to rake the waterline. Marines in the leading waves were cut down where they stood, the sea exploding with red and foam. Those who dropped for cover found only open reef and waist-deep water. The surrender had been a lure, a deliberate deception designed to draw them into the kill zone. The Japanese gunners had waited patiently for the Americans to close within point-blank range before opening fire. Within minutes, entire assault platoons were pinned in the surf, trapped between the coral reef and the shoreline bunkers. The white flags now lay torn in the sand, fluttering weakly from bullet impacts. The illusion of surrender had vanished, replaced by the grim understanding that this landing would be unlike any before it. By the time the second wave came in, the lagoon had become a graveyard. Amphibious tractors smoldered where they had stalled on the reef, burning with a chemical fire that sent black smoke into the pale sky. The men inside had been scythed by gunfire before they could even reach the sand. Those still alive used the wrecks as cover, pressing themselves against the steel while bullets hissed through the air inches above the waterline. The calm turquoise lagoon that morning had turned crimson in streaks that drifted with the tide. The Japanese had prepared every inch of Betio for this moment. Intelligence later revealed that their commander, Rear Admiral Shibasaki, had ordered his men to fight to the last cartridge. Concrete bunkers and pillboxes, reinforced with coral and palm logs, were linked by tunnels that allowed defenders to shift positions unseen. Gun ports were angled low, perfectly aligned with the reef, waiting for Marines to wade into range. Machine guns, 13 heavy weapons, and 75 howitzers were buried so deep that naval bombardment had done little more than scar their roofs. The white flags were part of a deception plan rehearsed for weeks to make Americans believe the garrison was surrendering, drawing them forward into interlocking fields of fire. The first few Marines to crawl onto the beach found themselves surrounded by death. The sand was so flat there was no cover except the corpses and fragments of landing craft scattered like driftwood. Communications broke down quickly. Radios were lost to saltwater or destroyed by shrapnel. Officers were killed before they could organize squads. Non-commissioned men took command on instinct, dragging others forward inch by inch, using shell craters as shallow foxholes. They fired at gun ports that seemed to vanish when targeted, only to reappear from another angle moments later. At 9:30, naval gunfire resumed at the request of forward observers pinned on the reef. Shells from destroyers crashed into the beaches less than 200 yards from the Marines still struggling in the surf. The concussions hurled geysers of coral and smoke into the air, temporarily silencing several bunkers. When the firing stopped, the survivors sprinted across the last stretch of sand, falling into ditches filled with bodies and twisted metal. They had made it, barely. Behind them, the sea continued to swallow men and machines. The deception had worked exactly as intended. What had looked like surrender was a coordinated ambush that shattered the first 2 assault waves. Of the roughly 800 Marines who waded in at the opening, more than half were killed or wounded within the first 90 minutes. The lagoon was littered with equipment that floated like wreckage from a sunken fleet. Yet amid the carnage, small groups pushed forward, crawling past shattered bunkers to find firing angles of their own. It was in those desperate moments that the battle shifted from chaos to grim determination, and where the true nature of Betio's defenses would be exposed. By midday, the tide had receded even further, stranding wrecked landing craft on the exposed reef like rusting skeletons. The heat rose in shimmering waves from the coral, and the stench of burned fuel mixed with blood and seawater. Narrow beach, survivors of the first waves fought yard by yard, taking cover behind wreckage and shallow depressions carved by explosions. The initial deception with white flags had cost them dearly, but now the fight shifted from survival to retaliation. Marine fire teams began coordinating their fire in bursts, using every weapon available to silence the concealed guns that had pinned them for hours. Flamethrower units, operating in pairs, moved along the beach behind small groups of riflemen. They targeted bunker openings, spraying liquid fire into narrow slits while grenades rolled in after. The heat from the flames turned the interior of those pillboxes into furnaces, consuming ammunition and oxygen alike. The smell of scorched wood and burning oil spread over the sand. Japanese defenders fought to the end, emerging from burning trenches still firing pistols and rifles before collapsing into the sand. By early afternoon, the first significant breaches were made in the line of defenses along Red Beach 2. Combat engineers followed, using satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes to widen the gaps. Their progress was slow and perilous. Every few yards brought another bunker entrance or firing slit. A single step in the wrong direction could expose them to machine gun fire from a position still hidden beneath coral. The Japanese defenders inside those labyrinths of tunnels had rehearsed these ambushes to perfection. They would let the Marines pass, then open fire from behind or trigger explosive traps buried beneath the sand. Every palm log, every mound of coral rubble might conceal a rifle barrel or a mine. The Marines learned quickly to probe the ground ahead with bayonets before stepping forward. By late afternoon, forward observers had re-established contact with the offshore destroyers. Precise naval gunfire was called in again, pounding remaining strongpoints on the western end of the island. The coordination between the trapped infantry and the ships offshore became a lifeline. Destroyer shells landed so close that fragments rained down on the Marines themselves, but they preferred that to being cut down in the open. As each bunker was reduced, small flags were planted to mark cleared zones, a grim reversal of the white flags that had started the massacre hours earlier. When night fell, the beachhead was barely secure, a strip no more than 200 yards deep, littered with burned-out tanks and the dead from both sides. The lagoon glowed faintly from fires still burning offshore. Marines huddled in shallow foxholes filled with brackish water, clutching rifles slick with salt. The enemy's deception had failed to halt the landing, but it had turned Betio into a killing ground that tested every inch of American endurance. The men who survived the first day no longer looked toward the horizon, their eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, knowing the next assault would push straight into the heart of the defenses. When daylight broke on the second day, the full scale of the Japanese defenses became clear. What had seemed like isolated pillboxes were only the visible tips of an underground fortress. Marines advancing inland discovered firing ports disguised as coral mounds, trenches concealed beneath fallen palm trunks, and tunnel systems deep enough to withstand hours of bombardment. Every few yards revealed a new entrance, a new ambush point. It was a maze carved from coral and reinforced with concrete, a miniature citadel built to delay, blade, and confuse the attacker. Intelligence officers moving behind the front lines began to sketch maps and diagrams, trying to understand how the entire island had been turned into a weapon. Captured documents found on dead officers confirmed that the Japanese had studied previous Allied landings carefully. They knew the Americans would rely on heavy pre-assault bombardments, so they had constructed bunkers with ceilings 5 feet thick, buried under sand and coral gravel. Inside were air ducts, ammunition caches, and reserve firing points. The deceptive white flags that had lured in the first wave were part of a formal defensive plan, not improvisation. Orders issued by Rear Admiral Shibasaki instructed gunners to simulate surrender only after the initial shelling, allowing Marines to close into a predesignated kill zone. In some positions, corpses of dead soldiers were propped up with flags in their hands, their bodies used as bait to sell the illusion. It was a strategy of deception born from desperation and resourcefulness. As the Marines pressed forward, these discoveries shaped their tactics. They began marking suspicious openings with colored smoke grenades, signaling to the tanks and flamethrower teams. M4A2 Sherman tanks, freshly landed and coated in coral dust, pushed inland to within yards of enemy trenches, their 75 guns blasting point-blank at concrete embrasures. Infantry followed close behind, clearing the surviving pockets with grenades and automatic fire. Every destroyed bunker taught the same lesson, that underestimating Japanese defenders was fatal. Compassion had no place on a battlefield where surrender could mean slaughter. By the afternoon of November 22nd, the Marine Command had a clearer picture of the enemy's defensive doctrine. Intelligence teams pieced together intercepted radio fragments revealing that Shibasaki had ordered no survivors. His final transmission had claimed, 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. That defiance, backed by deception, had nearly come true, but now the tide was turning. Artillery pieces hauled ashore began pounding the far end of Betio, where the last Japanese strongholds clung to the sea wall. Spotter planes from escort carriers circled overhead, relaying targets to destroyers offshore. Coordination was improving, and lessons learned in blood were being applied hour by hour. The Marines no longer hesitated when they saw motion or flags ahead. Every sign of surrender was met first with warning bursts, then silence, then a cautious advance. The initial naivety that had cost so many lives had burned away, replaced by a cold, professional focus. The deception at Tarawa had achieved its purpose once, but it would never work again. The third day on Betio began in silence broken only by the crack of rifles and the muted thud of mortars. The beach that had once been a trap was now the base of a relentless advance. The Marines, hardened by what they had endured, moved forward with a precision born from exhaustion and fury. Every yard of coral sand was won through the destruction of another bunker, another hidden trench, another desperate last stand. The deception of the first day had stripped away all illusions about the nature of this war. It was not about maneuver or honor, but annihilation and endurance. Combat engineers led the push, crawling ahead with explosives wired together in canvas bags. They placed the charges against bunker doors or air vents, signaled and flattened themselves into the sand as the blasts ripped through concrete and coral. Each explosion left a brief silence, followed by secondary detonations as ammunition inside cooked off. Riflemen swept through immediately after, clearing what remained. The air was thick with dust and the smell of cordite. Shermans clanked forward, their tracks grinding over shell casings and debris, guns elevating and firing at point-blank range. The island trembled under its own destruction. Casualty stations on the reef operated around the clock. Navy corpsmen, knee-deep in tidewater, worked over the wounded beneath tarps rigged from ponchos. Supplies washed ashore with the tide, crates of ammunition, medical kits, rations, some soaked with blood, others riddled with shrapnel holes. Chaplains moved among the dying quietly, offering water instead of words. The scale of loss was staggering. In the first 76 hours, nearly 1 in every 5 Marines who landed on Tarawa had been killed or wounded, yet none turned back. Reinforcements from later waves moved inland without hesitation, stepping past bodies half buried in sand and shell fragments. By the afternoon of November 23rd, organized resistance had collapsed into isolated pockets. Japanese soldiers continued to fight from ruins and trenches until the very last moment, refusing capture even when surrounded. Some detonated grenades rather than surrender. A few were taken alive, dazed, burned, or unconscious. From them, intelligence officers extracted the final details of the defensive plan. The deception had been approved weeks before the battle as part of a broader psychological defense, to delay the Marines, sap their morale, and inflict maximum confusion before being overwhelmed. It had succeeded in the first hours but failed to break their resolve. As the sun dipped low over the Pacific, the Marines finally reached the western edge of the island. There, amid the wreckage of Japanese positions and the shattered sea wall, they raised the stars and stripes. The flag's fabric hung limp in the heavy, salty wind. For the first time in 3 days, the guns fell silent. The victory had come at a price so high that few on that beach could feel triumph. The coral sands that had once gleamed white were now stained dark with fuel, smoke, and blood, an island that looked less like a battlefield and more like a warning written in earth and fire. In the aftermath of Tarawa, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps dissected every moment of the battle. What had begun with confidence in overwhelming firepower ended as a hard-earned education in the realities of island warfare. Reports compiled aboard the USS Maryland within days of the fighting highlighted the effectiveness of Japanese deception. The white flag incident was listed among the first cautionary examples. Commanders noted that no future landing could rely on the assumption of surrender. Every movement, every sign of compliance would henceforth be treated as a potential ruse until confirmed beyond doubt. The human instinct for mercy had cost hundreds of lives in the opening hour. From that point on, compassion in the Pacific would always walk hand in hand with suspicion. Back in Pearl Harbor, intelligence analysts cross-referenced the Tarawa findings with intercepted Japanese communications. They discovered similar instructions issued to garrisons on other islands, strategies emphasizing deception, delay, and psychological shock. The Japanese defense at Tarawa had not been unique. It was a prototype. The Marines had broken it, but at terrible cost. Training manuals were rewritten to include case studies from Betio, diagrams of bunker networks, tables showing fields of fire, and notes on identifying false surrenders. In the months that followed, those lessons saved lives on Kwajalein, Saipan, and Tinian, where the Marines advanced with practiced caution and ruthless efficiency. For the men who survived Tarawa, the memory lingered long after the island fell quiet. Veterans described the deceptive flags not as a trick, but as a revelation, proof that this war had crossed the threshold of humanity. Many admitted they never again looked at a white flag the same way. To them, it was no longer a symbol of surrender, but a mask that could hide death behind its folds. Letters sent home from survivors rarely mentioned heroism or victory. They spoke instead of confusion, disbelief, and the haunting image of those white strips fluttering above the reef just before the guns opened fire. By early 1944, Betio had been transformed into an airfield. Runways stretched across what had once been trenches and bunkers. Marines and Seabees built them side by side, burying the remains of thousands beneath the coral they poured into concrete. From that airstrip, bombers would strike deeper into the central Pacific, paving the way toward the Marianas. Tarawa became both a base and a symbol, a small island that taught an empire-sized lesson about preparation, deception, and sacrifice. When the final reports reached Washington, they carried a single line that summarized the battle more clearly than any photograph or dispatch. Victory was achieved not through firepower alone, but through the endurance of those who refused to be deceived twice. The coral sands of Betio had tested everything, tactics, technology, and trust, and revealed what it truly took to win a war fought in the shadows between courage and cunning.